The lights of late 1970s Los Angeles promised glamour, possibility, and fame. But in the shadows of those palm-lined streets moved a man whose charm was as dangerous as it was disarming. A man who could smile for a camera while carrying the weight of unspeakable secrets. On a summer afternoon, he might be the stranger offering to take a picture. That same evening, he might be a contestant on a cheerful television game show. Somewhere between the flash of the lens and the applause of the audience, lives were changed forever. This is the story of Rodney Alcala, the predator who hid in plain sight, and the trail of shattered lives he left behind. You are watching Dark Case Unit. Rodney James Alcala was born Rodrigo Jacques Alcala in late August of 1943 in San Antonio, Texas. He was the third of 4 children in what seemed, from the outside, to be a typical Mexican-American family. When he was about 8 years old, his father moved the family to Mexico. 3 years later, that same father walked out, abandoning Rodney, his siblings, and their mother, Anna Maria. That abandonment was a fault line that would run beneath the rest of his life. Left alone with 4 children, Rodney's mother eventually relocated the family to suburban Los Angeles, hoping for a fresh start. Rodney arrived in California around 11 years of age, effectively growing up without a father. Yet, on the surface, there were few outward signs of trouble. He was considered bright, even gifted. He attended private schools, did well academically, and classmates later recalled that he was reasonably popular. He served on the yearbook committee, ran track and cross country, and blended into the fabric of student life. To teachers and peers, he was the smart, sociable boy who seemed destined for success. Behind that presentation, something far darker was already taking shape. Those who later studied his life pointed to the father's disappearance as a turning point. Being uprooted and then abandoned at a young age can leave deep, unprocessed wounds. There were no documented acts of serious violence in his childhood, no obvious early crimes that would have warned anyone. But the stability of his family had been fractured early, and Rodney learned an enduring lesson. People who are supposed to protect you can vanish without warning. By his late teens, Rodney's life moved into another phase. After graduating from high school in the early 1960s, he joined the United States Army. He enlisted as a paratrooper and was eventually assigned clerical duties. To the outside world, the narrative seemed straightforward. A bright young man serving his country, moving from promising student to disciplined soldier. But the United States Army would become the first institution to formally see beneath the mask. Military records and later accounts describe him as manipulative, defiant, and insubordinate. More troubling, there were reports that he assaulted young women while in the service. The details are sparse, but the pattern is clear. When he was away from home and supervision, the violence inside him began to surface. In his early 20s, Rodney went absent without leave from Fort Bragg in North Carolina. He fled across the country to his mother's home in California. When the Army finally detained him, he underwent psychiatric evaluation. Military psychiatrists concluded that he suffered from antisocial personality disorder. Later, doctors would add narcissistic personality disorder and sexual sadism. His intelligence was measured as remarkably high. In plain terms, they described a man with a high intellect, an alarming lack of empathy, a talent for deceit, and an ability to harm others without remorse. Despite this, he received a medical discharge in the mid-1960s. There was no criminal record from his assaults in the Army, no long-term treatment plan that kept him contained. He walked back into civilian life with a clean legal slate and a dangerous psychological profile. Back in California, he tried to resume what looked like a normal life. He enrolled at the University of California, Los Angeles, and earned a degree in fine arts before the end of that decade. He developed an interest in photography and film. At different times, he would be described, often incorrectly, as having studied under high-profile directors. The truth is more mundane, but more chilling. He was educated, charismatic, and free. Underneath all of that, he was evolving into a predator. The first known explosion of that violence took place in late September of 1968 in Los Angeles. That morning, 8-year-old Tally Shapiro was walking to school along Sunset Boulevard. Her family was staying at a nearby hotel. A man with long hair pulled up beside her and offered her a ride. She did not know him. At first, she refused. He insisted that he knew her parents, that she would be safe, that he was simply trying to help. In a different era, in a different culture, a frightened child had no ready vocabulary for stranger danger. Tali got into the car. A salesman named Donald, driving along the same road, noticed the interaction. The sight of a small girl, hesitant, being coaxed into a car by an adult man, triggered his instincts. Something felt wrong. He followed the vehicle at a distance and watched as the man took the child into an apartment. Then he did something that changed the course of this story. He found a payphone and called the police. Officer Chris Camacho responded. When he arrived, the door was locked. Taking in the silence and the unease, he forced the door open. Inside, he stepped into a nightmare. Tali lay on the floor, severely injured, covered in blood. A metal bar had been used to crush and constrict her neck. She was unconscious, but still alive. The officer removed the bar, and she gasped for air. He had a choice in that moment: pursue the attacker who had fled out the back, or stay with the child and save her life. He chose the child. Tali survived after weeks in a coma and a long period of recovery. The physical injuries healed with time. The memory never truly did. This was the first documented crime of Rodney Alcala. It showed the full depth of his depravity. A lured child, a brutal attack, a victim left for dead. It also showed the first cracks in his illusion of invisibility. The police now had his name and his face, but he slipped away again. By the time authorities identified him as the attacker in the Shapiro case, he had already fled California. Under the alias John Berger, he surfaced in New York. He enrolled in film classes, insinuated himself into artistic circles, and tried on the role of the creative outsider. Beneath that persona, he was already pushing past the boundaries of non-fatal violence. In the early 1970s, 23-year-old flight attendant Cornelia, called Corey Crilly, was found in her Manhattan apartment, strangled with her own stockings. She had recently moved into that apartment. A friendly stranger had offered to help her carry things. She had let him in. The man she trusted was Rodney Alcala. At that time, forensic science could not connect him to her murder. The case went cold and stayed that way for decades. Years later, another promising young woman vanished under eerily similar circumstances. Ellen Jane Hover, the daughter of a prominent nightclub owner and the goddaughter of legendary entertainers, disappeared from her Manhattan apartment in the summer of 1977. Her diary recorded a meeting scheduled with a John Berger for that day. Her remains were eventually found outside the city on land connected to a famous estate. Again, there was no immediate way to tie the crime to Alcala. Investigators suspected him but lacked the hard evidence they needed. He had learned how to slip through the cracks of systems designed to catch ordinary criminals, not predators who lived behind a mask of charm and talent. While his crimes on the East Coast brewed unanswered questions, his past was catching up with him. In New Hampshire, 2 children at an arts camp thought their counselor, John Berger, looked familiar. They had seen his face on a wanted poster in a post office. That counselor was Rodney Alcala. Police were alerted. He was arrested and extradited back to California to face charges for the attack on Tali Shapiro. What followed was the beginning of a pattern that allowed him to keep harming people. Tali's family, deeply traumatized, had relocated to another country. They did not want their child to relive the attack in open court. Without her testimony, prosecutors believed they could not successfully pursue the most serious charges. Instead of attempted murder, they accepted a plea for a lesser offense related to child assault. For the near-fatal attack on an 8-year-old girl, Rodney Alcala received a sentence measured in only a few years. He served just under 3 years, and then was paroled. He walked out of prison a registered offender, but a free man. Within weeks, he was back to the same patterns. He lured a 13-year-old girl, known in records as Julie, into his car. She survived the assault, and he was arrested again. This time he was imprisoned for 2 more years. Again, he was paroled. The message was clear to him. The system could catch him, but it could not or would not contain him. By the time he stood on the streets of Los Angeles as a man in his mid-30s, He was a twice-convicted offender with a history of extreme violence and a mind that had only grown more practiced in deception. The bodies began to appear. In late 1977, 18-year-old Jill Barcombe was found in the Hollywood Hills. She had recently arrived from New York, hoping to build a life in California. Her body was left on a dirt path, posed, beaten, and strangled with ligatures. Investigators at first suspected the notorious hillside stranglers operating in the area, but later ruled them out. Jill's murder remained unsolved. A few weeks later, 27-year-old nurse Georgia Wixt was found in her Malibu home. A window latch had been broken. The home was in disarray. She had been attacked in her bedroom, sexually assaulted, and strangled with her own stockings. The violence was extreme, even by the grim standards of homicide cases. The killer had used a mixture of binding, beating, and strangulation. Investigators collected a handprint and other biological evidence at the scene, carefully preserving what they did not yet have the technology to fully understand. The pattern was emerging. A man who approached women, gained their trust, entered their homes or private spaces, and used whatever was at hand as a weapon. Stockings, ropes, shoelaces. A man who left bodies posed in ways that suggested a twisted need for control long after life had left them. In the summer of 1978, 32-year-old legal secretary Charlotte Lamb went out dancing at a Santa Monica nightclub. She never made it back safely. Her body was found in a laundry room at a residential complex where she had been staying. She had been restrained, sexually assaulted, and strangled with a shoelace. Bite marks were visible on her body. Evidence was collected and stored, waiting for a future that could interpret it. 1 year later came 21-year-old college student and key punch operator Jill Parenteau. When she did not show up for work, friends grew worried. Police found signs of forced entry at her apartment. She was discovered in the bathroom, unclothed, posed, and strangled. Blood droplets at the window indicated the intruder had cut himself climbing inside. All of these victims, all of these scenes, spoke of one offender. But in those years, the pieces still sat in separate files, in separate police departments, connected by little more than hunches. During this same period, Rodney Alcala was working as a typesetter at a major Los Angeles newspaper. Co-workers knew him as the quiet photographer who constantly carried his camera. He would ask colleagues, strangers on the street, women at the beach, and young men and boys if he could take their picture. Many agreed. The photographs would one day become critical evidence in understanding the full scope of his activities. To the people around him, he was just another eccentric artist in a city full of them. That was the point. That was the mask. And then came the moment that would give him a notorious nickname, the dating game killer. In the late 1970s, television game shows were a staple of entertainment. One of them, a dating game where a bachelorette chose between 3 unseen bachelors, wanted a charismatic contestant to keep the show lively. Producers met an affable man in his mid-30s who introduced himself as a photographer and former skydiver. He smiled easily. He knew how to perform. They did not run background checks. In that era, criminal records in one state were not instantly visible to producers in another. They saw what was in front of them: a confident, good-looking man who could banter on camera. Rodney Alcala became Bachelor number 1. During the taping, the Bachelorette asked the 3 men suggestive, playful questions. The studio audience laughed at his double meanings and flirtatious answers. He leaned into the innuendo, seeming at ease under the hot studio lights. The episode presents a chilling contrast. A man who, between murders, could step into a television studio and charm a crowd with practiced wit. When the time came to choose, the Bachelorette selected Bachelor number 1. When the partition slid back, the two met face to face. To millions of viewers at home, it seemed like a typical television moment. Off camera, her instincts told her something different. After the show, she reported feeling an overpowering sense that something was wrong, that this man was not safe. Soon afterward, she contacted the production team and asked to cancel the date. The show had no rule forcing her to go. She never saw him again. That decision likely saved her life. The dating show appearance is often treated as a bizarre footnote. In the context of his crimes, it is more than that. It is a snapshot of how ordinary he could appear and how willing he was to put himself in front of cameras, confident that no one would see the darkness behind the smile. While the public remembered him as a contestant, Rodney Alcala continued to target victims. He approached teenage girls and young women with the same line. He was a photographer building a portfolio. Would they like to model? For some, the answer was yes. For one 15-year-old girl named Monique, the price of trusting him was nearly fatal. On Valentine's Day of 1979, Monique was hitchhiking when Alcala picked her up. He drove her away from the city, toward a remote area near a desert park. There he photographed her, assaulted her, and attempted to kill her. Despite her injuries, she survived and later managed to escape when he stopped at a gas station. She reported the crime. For once, he was arrested quickly. But again, he was released on bail while awaiting trial. During that window of freedom, he struck again. In June of 1979, 12-year-old Robin Samsoe spent the day at the beach in Huntington Beach, California. She was with a friend, enjoying the start of summer. A tall man with a camera approached and asked to photograph them. A nearby adult intervened, unsettled by his behavior. He left. Later that afternoon, Robin borrowed a bicycle to ride to ballet class. She never arrived. Her disappearance sparked an intensive search. Friends told police about the photographer on the sand. With their help, a composite sketch was created. That sketch was circulated widely. A parole officer recognized the likeness. It looked exactly like his parolee, Rodney Alcala. 12 days after Robin vanished, her remains were discovered off a mountain road in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. The remains were badly decomposed, but dental records confirmed her identity. The circumstances matched a pattern. A child approached by a man with a camera, then taken, assaulted, and killed. The community was devastated. Parents who had allowed their children to walk or ride bikes alone no longer felt safe doing so. Police moved quickly. They traced Rodney Alcala, searched the home where he lived, and arrested him for the kidnapping and murder of Robin Samsoe. In that search, investigators found something vital: a pair of small, gold ball earrings in his possession. Robin's mother had reported that her daughter had been wearing such earrings the day she vanished. They were missing from the scene where her body was found. The earrings were just one piece in a larger puzzle, but they would become a powerful symbol at trial. There was more. As the investigation expanded, a rented storage locker in Seattle came to light. Inside, detectives found hundreds of photographs of women, girls, boys, and young men. Some were clothed, some partially clothed. Some posed in ways that suggested vulnerability or power imbalance. For many of these people, their names were unknown. What they all shared was a moment in front of the lens of Rodney Alcala. Interspersed among the photographs were items of jewelry, earrings, bracelets, small personal objects. Many victims of serial offenders never learn what happened to belongings that disappeared with their loved ones. In this case, some of those missing pieces were lying in cardboard boxes thousands of miles away from the scenes of the crimes. Among those items, investigators found earrings that would later be matched, through witness identification and forensic work, to murder victims in California. Years later, when these photographs were released to the public, families recognized faces of women who had been missing for decades. Others saw themselves, realizing they had once been in a room with a man who went on to become a notorious killer. The storage locker functioned as a private archive, a collection of trophies, and at the same time, a silent record of how wide his reach might have been. The first trial for the murder of Robin Samsoe took place in the early 1980s in Orange County, California. The prosecution relied on witness testimony from the beach, the composite sketch that matched him, and the discovery of the earrings in his possession. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. For Robin's family, it seemed that justice, however incomplete, had been served. But the legal process was not finished. Years later, the conviction was overturned on procedural grounds. The jury had been told about his prior convictions, which appellate courts later ruled had prejudiced the trial. A second trial was held. He was again convicted, and again sentenced to death. And again, the conviction was overturned, this time by a federal court concerned with specific issues surrounding expert testimony and witness handling. Each reversal forced Robin's family, and the families of his other suspected victims, to watch as the case reopened, and the man they believed responsible was moved back into a position of legal uncertainty. While he remained incarcerated, something else had changed. Science had caught up with the evidence. By the early 2000s, California law allowed investigators to collect DNA samples from prisoners. When Rodney Alcala's DNA profile was entered into databases and compared with old evidence, it began to unlock cold cases. Biological material preserved from the murders of Jill Barcombe, Georgia Wixt, Charlotte Lamb, and Jill Parenteau now had a match. Each match was a voice from the past, calling out from a file long thought unsolvable. This was not a man suspected in one murder. He was now scientifically linked to multiple killings across years and locations. Prosecutors sought and received permission to try all 5 California murders together: Jill, Georgia, Charlotte, Jill, and Robin. It would be one of the most significant serial murder trials in state history. In the 3rd California trial, held in the early 2010s, Rodney Alcala made an extraordinary decision. He chose to represent himself. He stood in a courtroom wearing a suit, questioning witnesses about the very crimes he was accused of committing. He cross-examined people who had been photographed by him, those who had discovered bodies, and experts who interpreted DNA and blood spatter. At one point, he questioned himself in a different tone of voice, then answered as the defendant. This was not the behavior of a man prepared to quietly accept responsibility. It was the performance of someone who still believed he could talk his way through anything. During the penalty phase, the prosecution called a witness they had deliberately held back until that moment, Tali Shapiro. The child he had attacked in 1968 was now an adult woman. She told the jury what had happened to her as a girl, how a man had offered a ride, how the world went black and came back in a hospital. Her presence was powerful, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder that his violence did not begin in the late 1970s. It had deep roots. The jury convicted him on all 5 counts of first-degree murder and recommended the death penalty. The judge agreed and sentenced him accordingly. Even as the California cases reached that conclusion, another jurisdiction was preparing to act. In New York, prosecutors finally had what they needed to charge him with the murders of Cornelia Corey Crilly and Ellen Hover, the young flight attendant found in her Upper East Side apartment, and the aspiring musician who vanished after a planned meeting with John Berger. Advances in DNA technology, combined with the history established in California, gave Manhattan district attorneys enough to move forward. He was extradited, charged, and eventually pleaded guilty to both murders. He received sentences of 25 years to life for each count, to be served concurrently with his California sentence. The families of Cornelia and Ellen heard, in a courtroom in New York, the formal acknowledgement that the man already condemned for other killings had also taken their daughters from them. As the years passed, additional possible victims came into focus. Photographs from his storage locker continued to circulate. Families of missing people examined them, hoping not to see a familiar face and at the same time needing to know. In one case, the image of a young woman on a motorcycle led investigators to identify Christine, a woman who had disappeared in the late 1970s. Her remains had been found in another state in the early 1980s, unidentified for years. When DNA testing finally gave her a name, the photograph provided a chilling connection. She had met Rodney Alcala at some point before she died. He denied harming her. He denied many things. The record of his proven crimes tells its own story. Through all of this, he remained incarcerated on death row in California. Changes in state policy meant that executions were placed under a moratorium, effectively transforming his sentence into life imprisonment. In his later years, his health deteriorated. Reports described him as frail, no longer the confident figure seen on a game show stage or in old police photographs. In late July of 2021, Rodney James Alcala died in a hospital while still in state custody. He was in his late 70s. The cause of death was reported as natural. He never faced execution. He never publicly expressed remorse. He left behind unanswered questions. How many of the unidentified faces in his photographs represent people who were harmed by him? How many assaults were never reported? How many families never knew that the stranger Their loved one, once described as a photographer or a guy with a camera, was the same man now known to history as the dating game killer. What remains, clearly and painfully, are the victims. Young girls on their way to school or dance class, whose lives were interrupted on an ordinary day. Women in their 20s and 30s, building careers and chasing dreams in Los Angeles and New York, who opened their doors to the wrong person. Families who carried grief for decades, who waded through appeals and retrials, who sat in courtrooms listening to clinical descriptions of what had happened to their daughters, sisters, and friends. The story of Rodney Alcala is not only about a single predator. It is about how easy it can be for someone like him to blend into everyday life. He was not a shadowy figure hiding in alleys. He was a photographer at the beach, a colleague in a newsroom, a contestant on a game show. He used ordinary roles as camouflage. It is also about systems that were not designed for someone like him. A time when criminal records did not cross state lines easily, when parole for violent offenders was more generous, when the tools needed to connect crimes decades apart simply did not exist. Today, forensic science is more sophisticated. Databases are more integrated. Public awareness of predatory behavior is far higher. But the lessons of cases like this one remain. Trust instincts, report suspicious behavior, and take seriously the patterns that emerge over time. Most of all, remember the names of those whose lives were taken. This is Dark Case Unit. If you watched this far, you are part of a community that believes stories like this should be told with care, respect, and focus on the victims rather than the myth of the killer. If you found this deep dive informative and you want more long-form investigations into dark, complex cases, please take a moment to like this video, leave a thoughtful comment, and subscribe to Dark Case Unit. It helps more than you know, and it tells the platform to share these stories with others who care about justice, memory, and truth. Stay safe, stay curious, and until the next case, this has been Dark Case Unit.